Hello all. In this lecture, I am going to explain about another one application layer protocol called HTTP, it is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Hypertext Transfer Protocol is a protocol mainly used to access data from the World Wide Web. Already we have discussed about World Wide Web. It is a repository of information collected from different points all over the world. And when you store different information in a repository, you need to take the information from that. So in order to access the information from that repository, we need a protocol that is nothing but a HTTP protocol. So it is having some similarities to FTP and SMTP. It is similar to FTP because it transfers files and uses the services of TCP. So in FTP you have checked that we have a data connection and a control connection, and it will be transferring files from one over the other, and over the control connection it will be transmitting only the commands. Over the data connection it will be transmitting the data. Here HTTP is also making the services of TCP, and it also will be creating a connection between the two people, but it is much simpler than FTP because it is using only one connection, whereas in FTP you have two different connections, one for control and one for data. Here there is no separate connection for control and data. HTTP will be using a single connection for both the control commands as well as the data, because here data is not always mandatory. Certain cases it will be transferring data, certain cases it will transfer only the commands. So it is similar to FTP in a feature like it will be establishing a connection using transmission control protocol, and over that connection only it will be doing the control communication. And when you see the similarity with SMTP, these HTTP messages are looking like SMTP messages. The message format of HTTP, in HTTP when you use the commands and responses, the format of the message is a kind of similarity to the SMTP messages. So this is what is the reason how it is having some similarity with FTP and SMTP. But unlike SMTP, the HTTP messages are not destined to be read by the human. They are read and interpreted by the HTTP server and the client. So the thing is here, SMTP is mail transfer protocol. Finally, the mail will be read by the user. But here HTTP messages which are being transmitted between two systems will not be available to the user, whereas the user will be viewing the web pages which is stored in the World Wide Web. Okay, so in order to access the web pages, the system will be using HTTP protocol. The transaction which is happening in the HTTP protocol will not be visible to the human, so we will not manually visiting the command formats or the response formats whatever being communicated in the HTTP, but as a result we will be seeing the web pages of the World Wide Web. So SMTP messages are stored and forwarded, but HTTP messages are delivered immediately. So if you see the SMTP transport model, you can able to view a queue over there in the message transfer agent. So when the user agent is producing the messages, it will be stored in the MTA server, and one by one it will be transmitted over the internet to the other server. Whereas in HTTP there is no process of storing and all. When it comes from one client, it will be immediately delivered to the server of the HTTP. There is no storing concept. The commands from the client to the server are embedded in a request message. The contents of the requested file or other information are embedded in a response message. So here the commands and response, the communication is happening like command and response. The client will send a command to the server will in turn respond to the request message. The commands are in the form of a request message. The server's replies will be in the form of a response message. And HTTP uses TCP on a well-known port number 80. So already we have seen for the FTP 20 and 21, whereas for SMTP it is 25, and for HTTP the TCP is using the well-known port number as 80. And next we are going to see about the format of messages which are being used in HTTP. So the client initialize the transaction by sending a request message. So when the client wants to access a site or wants to access a web page, immediately he will send a response. So in the World Wide Web we have seen it will be giving a request to the site. Before that, it will be giving a request to the HTTP, because HTTP, when sending a request, it is automatically going to the HTTP protocol. For every request message, the server replies by sending a response. Sometimes the server will say okay, sometimes the server will say not okay. That is, you can't be able to get the web page or it cannot be connected. Okay, so every time when the HTTP client is sending a request to the HTTP server, the server will give a response message. So this is what is the format of the request and response message used in HTTP. So if you see the request message, you have a request line, whereas in the response message you have a status line, and you will have a header and then a blank line and then the body. So body is nothing but the actual data. It is optional. Sometimes it will be there, sometimes it will not be there, but these three things are mandatory: request line, header and a blank line. Blank line means just a blank line which is just indicating that the request line and header line are over, and the information after the blank line is nothing but the body of the message. So here we are going to check about what is request line, what is header format again. So the format we are going to discuss in detail. So if you see the request line, you have a request type, URL, HTTP version, and if you see the status line, you have a HTTP version, status code and status phrase. So in this HTTP version we are using 1.1 version, so that is what is the version number, and URL is nothing but the particular resource locator that you already know what is the URL. There are 4 parts in the URL. So the same URL what we have already discussed in World Wide Web is this URL. So we have to discuss the new things which are nothing but the request type, status code and status phrase. So there is a relation between status code and status phrase. Status phrase is nothing but the information which is given by the status code by means of a text. Okay, so status code means it is a 3-digit number similar to your SMTP. It is again a 3-digit number. So these are all the status codes. So for every number you have a meaning. So the corresponding meaning, the text is nothing but the status phrase, and this is the description. So this is status code, this is status phrase. So there are so many status codes are available which is there in the response message. So when the server wants to respond client, he will respond by means of the status code and the phrase. Both the things will be there in your status line. Okay, so from that number and the phrase, the client will understand the process, what the server is trying to tell me. Whereas the request type, if you see, the request type is used in the request message. Here the request type we are calling it as methods. So if you see this, these are the request types. So every method, this is get, head, post, put, trace, connect option. These are the request types. So every request type is having a specific action. For example, get, if I am sending a request type, that means the client is requesting a document from the server. Head means the client is requesting an information about a document but not the document. Post means the client wants to send some information to the server. Put means send a document from the server to the client. Trace means echoes the incoming request. Connect means result. Option means inquires about available options. So this is what is the request type. So every time the client wants to make a request, he will first mention what is the request type, and he'll mention the URL, the client URL, which particular URL I want to access. The client will be telling that, and then the HTTP version. For that, the server will be responding with the version. Status code. Status code is nothing but the number. So this is a 3-digit number. So there are so many numbers, it's not necessary to memorize all these numbers, all the status codes. You have to just understand what is status code, that's all. So the numbers which are in 100 range, 200 range, certain values are there, 300, 400, 500 ranges are there. You have to just understand, if the code is in the range of 100, it is just an informational code, just an information. Okay, it's just telling something, that's all. Whereas the codes in the 200 range is indicating a successful request, which means this is what is coming from the server, right? If the server is simply passing an information, it will be using some code in the 100 range, that is the client, you may continue with the request, or else you may be switching to another server or another protocol. Like that, the number will be 100. Whereas 200, if it is sending 200 range of numbers, means it is corresponds to a successful request. That is, a request what you have sent is successfully received by me and it is successfully accepted. Whereas the codes in the 300 range are redirecting the client to another URL, because you are sending to a particular server. If the server is not the correct person, he will be informing the client that you have to switch to a different URL. That is in the form of T, that is moved permanently. That is, the requested URL is no longer available, it's moved permanently, it is not available, the document is not available. Such kind of information is given by the codes, which is in the range of 300, whereas 400 means it is indicating an error in the client side, 500 indicating an error at the server side. Okay, so this only you have to understand what is this codes corresponds to. Rather, it is not mandatory to remember all the different codes in the basic knowledge about HTTP. You have to just understand what is the status code and what is the status codes are inferring the user or the HTTP client. And the status phrase, as I have already told you, it is the status code in the text form. Okay. And then the next one, so if you see the messages, the first line, request line and status line we have discussed, and the next is the header. So the header is having a format, header name, and then a colon, and then a space, and then the header value. So the header is nothing but is exchanging the additional information between the client and the server. So first in the request line and the status line, they will be telling what I am requesting and what is the response to the request. Additional information about the communication is being given by the header. The header, there are four different types of header. General header, request header, response header, and entity header. So the request message, when you take, it can have a general header, a request header, or an entity header, whereas a response message can have a general header, response header, and entity header. Means a response header cannot be a part of a request message. Similarly, a request header cannot be a part of your response message. So this is the simple example showing you the response and the request message. So see that from the client, this messages, as a user we will not able to view this message. These messages are exchanged between the HTTP client and the server. As a result of this exchanges, we will be viewing the web page only. But this is what is the format of the message which is being exchanged between the client and the server. So if you see the request, the first line is the request line. So post, this is the request type, and then there is a space, and then you have the URL. This is the URL, that is /cgibin/doc.pl. This is the URL, HTTP version 1.1. And after that you have a header. The first one is a header name, and then a colon, and then a space, and then the header value. So the header value, each and every value will have a meaning. So what is the header type corresponds to the header values corresponds to, it's not the scope of our syllabus. So we are just seeing the format. Suppose if such a kind of a message is given to you, and if you are asked to rewrite which is the header type, which is the header value, which is the request type, which is the URL used in this message, which is the version used in this message, you have to rewrite based on the format. You have to take it from this. So these are all the headers. First 4 lines, if you see, all are having the same format, and then a blank line, and then the input information, optional information will be there. Similarly, if you see the response message, the version, and then the code, and then the status phrase, and the header type, colon, space, and the header value. Similarly, all these are headers, then a blank line, then a body of the document. So this is what is the exchanges happening between the client and the server. This is given in the format in the last lines. So general header, request header, response header, entity header, these are the 4 different headers. You have to just understand what is this headers are going to give. Generally, header is an additional information, whereas the general header gives some general information about the message and can be present in both a request and a response. Some general information. What else? What I could say, like it is for example, if you see this, except is a general information, and server, this is a general information. So this date and server, these are some general information. So this is kind of general information will be there given by the general header. A request header can be present only in a request message. It specifies the client's configuration and the client's preferred document format. Client's configuration and the client's preferred document format. So here image in GIF, image in JPEG, these are all kind of request headers, because it is telling that the client wants the information in this particular format. GIF message, when you are putting in Google, suppose if you want to see some images in GIF, you will be just typing, right? This information will be taken by the HTTP client and inform the HTTP server that the client wants GIF messages, GIF images or JPEG images. The content length he wants is 50. So this request additional information about the request will be given by this header, that is request header. The response header can be present only in the response message. It specifies the server's configuration and special information about the request. So server name is Challenger. It is using a version 1. So this is server configuration. So server information about the server will be given by the response header. The entity header gives information about the body of the document. Although it is most presently in response messages, some request messages, post and put commands then contain a body. So it is the entity header is giving the information about the body of the message. For example, content length 50. It is the entity header is present only in post and put methods. Method is nothing but the request type. Post and put methods only it will be present. Here the example, luckily we have taken the post method. So you have this content length is 50 and the response is also having content length is 2000. This is what is the entity header. So if this particular headers if you take, or the request and response messages if you take, the first line corresponds to the request line, and the header, the first header is simply corresponds to the general header, accept, just the information, and the second header is nothing but the request header, GIF and JPEG information is required by the client, that is request header. Content length, this is entity header. Here there is no possibility of getting a response header. So this is a kind of a response message, and the response header is server name and the version used by the server. All those things are given. This is part of a response header. So these are the 4 different headers, and then the body of a message, it can be present in a request or response message. Is normally the document what you want to send or receive. The last topic is proxy server. HTTP supports proxy servers. Normally you would have listened to this topic, proxy. You would have heard about proxy. So proxy server is nothing but when a communication is happening between the client and the server, when I am sending a request to the server will give a response first time. This request and the response will be stored in a proxy server, kind of a temporary server. When the next time the client asks the same request, it will not go to the actual server, rather it will check the proxy server and it will give the response. What is the use? It can save time, decreases the traffic. Rather than going to the server, either using iterative resolution or using a recursive resolution, I have to reach the server. Without going to the server, I can use a local server that is called as a proxy server. So a proxy server is a computer that keeps copies of responses to recent requests. Okay, so the HTTP client sends a request to the proxy server first. The proxy server checks its hash memory. If the response is not stored in the hash, then the proxy server sends a request to the corresponding server. So whenever the HTTP client sends a request, first it will go to the proxy server. If the response is there in the proxy server, it will be given to the client. If it is not there, then the proxy server will forward the request to the actual server. Incoming responses are sent to the proxy server first and stored for future requests from other clients. So the proxy server is basically helpful to reduce the load on the original server, decreases traffic and improves latency. So this is what is the role of a proxy server in the HTTP protocol. Okay, so that's all with HTTP. So in HTTP, the major topic what you have to understand is the format of the messages. So you may be asked to explain the format of a request message and response message. Then you need to explain about the request line, what are the request type, this URL, HTTP version, and the header, different types of header, what are the things will be there in a header. All those things you need to explain. Okay, so that's all with the HTTP. So please listen to the topics and you practice the questions whichever is given in your assignment. Thank you all.